I was really pleased to be asked to come introduce my friend Caesar. Caesar and I have had a long history ourselves. Caesar is a historian that does not sit on a campus in an ivory tower where he decides what is historical and what's important to our lives by researching libraries, although he may do that too, and by reading classical books and so forth. Caesar is more than an anthropologist, I think. He gets out among the people, he gets out of the landscapes and the scenery that he wants to talk about, to write about, to explain to us. He's traveled 49 states. That's when we first met, when he was on his 1979 Chevy, right? Yeah. Chevy trip around 49 states. We brought Caesar back and put him in the Junior Orange Bowl parade in that car. It was a wonderful experience for people to get to meet someone who had seen so much of our country and interacted with people. Caesar just doesn't go out, he interacts. He's walked the Appalachian Trail, and this is the most amazing thing to me, that since about 2007 or so, he has walked from Key West, Florida to Arizona. I mean, I hope in spurts.
In spurts.
He just got back. It's been a long time. So anyways, one day I'm sitting at my desk as the Australian Honorary Consul, and I get a thing from Caesar, which is a 2007 Tequesta article about the Brickells, who, as we all know, not to steal Caesar's thunder, are some of the founders of our great city, community, and a connection that they had to Australia, which he will explain. But I got so excited, I immediately sent that article to the ambassador up in Washington, who got excited. I mean, this was something that was going to be a whole new connection between a far-off continent and our city. And if you can imagine a connection about those two places in the 1800s, it's just almost mind-boggling. So Caesar told me, I'm off for an adventure. I'm going to go find the Brickells in Australia. He may not find them personally, but he's going to find what they left behind them. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Caesar Becerra, who is about to speak here before he starts a semester at FIU talking to young people about this same thing. So Caesar, welcome.
Thank you. I too was born at Doctor's Hospital. It's an honor to be here. Bob, thanks for inviting me, and get ready. You know, my only intent in going to Australia was hopefully to walk in the footsteps of the Brickels and get some sort of a feeling. Everything that happened since I stepped foot really kind of really impressed me, far beyond what I thought I was going to find. But first we're going to get a few things out of the way here, and that is...
Last time they were able to dim the lights a little bit.
That would be great if we can. If we can, that would be great. First and foremost, just to get some things out of the way, yes, I did see a kangaroo. Yes, I did pet a kangaroo. Yes, I did feed a kangaroo. So, just so people know that definitely happened. I did see, obviously, some of the most iconic places in Australia. I did go on a one-week side sabbatical that I didn't know about at the time, but my friends in the Burning Man community said, you do know that the month you're coming, there's a festival. That's all I needed to hear to take a detour. And I saw some incredible art in the middle of nowhere that unfortunately is an area now that's under intense fires, etc. But mainly I went 3 out of the 4 weeks to go research and dig a little deeper and get a sense of the why, when, and how it all happened, kind of the foundation, if you will, of the Brickell story. And in particular, William and Mary Brickell, who met in Australia. And there were times that I really did feel like Mary was there. I did feel at other times William was there. And these were interesting kind of private moments that just happened. Like this gentleman, he was just a reenactor at a place that was reenacting the gold rush. There was a lot of busyness on the street, and all of a sudden everybody just kind of goes into stores, and this guy pops out, and it's just him, me on the street, and it's just this moment. It was in front of a bank building that did actually hold gold. And then there were buildings that I walked in and out of that are still there, that were there when William and Mary revisited. So this building, the train station in Albury, the city they met, wasn't there when they met, but when they came back on 2 occasions, this is the very building they had to come out of when they took a train to Albury. And there were hotels and properties that were there when Mary was a 3-year-old child in 1840 in Goulburn that are still there. And I say this because there's very few things in Miami that we can point to say, well, this was around and the Brickels are here. It's very hard, minus the mausoleum and a few other things. But even then, even the mausoleum came much later. And really, it's to get to a bigger point is, who are these people? And there is a generation out there that really, honestly, know the Brickell name. And as my good friend Paul pointed out last night, there are moments right now, politically, that there are certain roads that want to actually grab the Brickell name on the South Bayshore Drive, have it Brickell Bayshore Drive, etc. So there is definitely a knowledge of Brickell, but not necessarily knowing how they did what they did. And here's a good example. This is a $4 billion Swire property that took up, what, 3.5 blocks of property. And even though that's modern and glitzy and incredible, I could make a bridge, as I like to do, on anything with the Brickels. If you go back, when you went to the Brickell Trading Post, you could definitely buy, sell, and trade alligator hides. Well, there's a store at Brickell City Center where you can pay $6,000 for an alligator-surrounded cooler. No kidding, tinted in red. And I know that's an extreme, but there still is alligator hides being traded and sold and what have you. And of course, everything has changed. You know, we see the Brickell today, the downtown of today, this massive undertaking. And when you go back in this unbelievable photograph, and there are many unbelievable photographs that just, you got to scratch your head about, wow, how far we've come. To us, to Miami, to South Floridians, we tend to look at these photos as the beginning. But one of the conclusions that after going to Australia for a month and following the Brickels is that for the Brickels, this photo wasn't the beginning. This photo was a master's thesis at the end of their journey, or right before the beginning of the end of their journey. In fact, you'll learn on many occasions and things that have been corroborated, they had their master's degree in dealing and building cities and making big deals way before they got to Miami. Now, the focus of my journey was pretty much where they were. They both visited Melbourne and Sydney. And that line that I've drawn is pretty much the area that they would have been going back and forth. And today there is a mother road that we'll get to later, the impact that William Brickell had on creating this mother road. And in the middle is where they met. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the story of how I went to Australia begins not in Australia or even Miami, but in Hong Kong and in Japan. On the way back from Japan, after 19 hours on a plane, you would think that my parents had had enough of me and would want a little bit more space when we switched planes in Dallas to go to Miami. But they wanted to be with me. And there was a moment where they needed 5 volunteers to give up their seats for a $300 voucher. And instantly, my instincts kicked in. I said, my parents were getting coffee at the time. I said, well, they come back. I bet you they're going to say, no, stay with us. And sure enough, my mother, listen, I have enough points. I have money. I'll give you the points. Just come with us to I said, yeah, but Mom, that's $300 free, you know. She said, and my father, of course, supporting my mother, seeing that this was a little touchy subject, said, no, Caesar, you should just come. Just finish the trip with us. 5 minutes later, on the same microphone, ladies and gentlemen, we need 5 volunteers for a $500 voucher at the next Friday. This time, my mother still complained, but my father wasn't as quick to defend her. And 7 minutes later, on the microphone, ladies and gentlemen, we're looking for 5 people, and $880, 5 Mom, I just took it. Now, I didn't know what I was going to do with that $880 voucher. But 1 week later, I found myself in the Everglades being interviewed by a great filmmaker named Sasha Wurtzel and her amazing cinematographer, Jessica Bennett. And they wanted images of me out in the Everglades, kind of watching over the logging railroads, and we went to a section called Wagon Wheel Road. And then they said, well, that's great, but now we need you back kind of in your era of the paperwork and how you corroborate this, and let's go to your collection at FIU. And so we brought him to the largest state library, the largest library in the state of Florida, where my collection and other collections exist, even the Mary Brickell collection exists. And my good friend Vicky Silvera, who's here right now, the director of the special collection, pulled out, and she didn't know this, but she pulled out just the right boxes. And all I needed was a shot, and sure enough, we pulled out some things. And one of the things that I pulled out, and this was just a happenstance, was an article that I had put in those boxes many years later called William Barnwell Brickell in Australia. And I had forgotten, personally, I'd forgotten about reading this piece. And I don't know why, but I threw it in my bag. And as I exited FIU on many occasions, if and only if there is a Miami Today sitting. Oh, by the way, this article was written by Denise McMahon and Christine Wilde, which you'll see here in this picture and read about a little bit. I'll tell you a little bit about them, but I wouldn't be here right now whether they wouldn't put the flashlight in the dark about who the Brickells were and what they were doing. But I also got a copy of Miami Today now. Right outside the doors of the special collections, they always put a stack, or sometimes they don't. On this day they did, and I put it in the same bag that had the Brickell article in it. And that night I read the Brickell article, and then I opened up the Miami Today. And in that Miami Today was an article that my good friend Don Slesnick wrote. Here is the article itself. Australia adds firepower in Miami's century of mateship. And he was talking about the connections historically of the United States and Australia. Well, I called Don the next day. I said, Don, I love what you wrote, but guess what? There's a Miami connection. He said, what do you mean a Miami connection? Yeah, the Brickels were in Australia. He goes, what do you mean the Brickels were in Australia? And I sent them, that's when I sent you the piece. And that's when we started getting very excited. Don made a few calls. I even had a meeting in San Francisco at the Australian Consulate General, and people started getting in touch with the historians in Australia and historical societies. And these two remarkable ladies, which I can't say enough. So Denise McMahon on the left-hand side had a family member that you're going to hear about named Hiram Crawford. If she had not had that family member and not gotten into his history, who worked for the Brickels, even the fifth one's debatable. And then I heard on my radar an interesting lady named Beth Brickell. Notice I said Brickell and not Brickell. She pronounces it Brickell. And all the Australians, by the way, pronounce it Brickell. Now there was a slight part of the Brickels from England that went over to France, and the Brickells believe that that's where the Brickell pronunciation comes from. But there are Brickels that are Brickells. And Beth Brickell wrote a very interesting book, and now followed up with a second edition of that book, William and Mary Brickell, founders of Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And I had lunch the day before I went to Australia with her. And she gave me a copy of the second edition of the book. It has a lot more new information. And I had a good roadmap, but again, did not know. And with that, there's me holding the book in Australia. Now, who were these two ladies, and why did they spend so much time and money? On your left side, Denise McMahon, on the right, Christine Wilde. We're talking about an era years ago, before there was the internet, before there was you can now breathe Brickell on the internet and things will just shower down. The other day I did that and I found Mary Brickell's license for her car, the exact make and model of the car, without even trying much. These ladies, and they call them the girls, by the other historians that are much older than them, call these two guys the girls. The girls spent hundreds of hours, many years of their own dime, actually buying microfilm the old-fashioned way. Today you don't have to do that. There's a remarkable website called Trove in Australia where you can find any name at any moment in time that's ever been published. But they did it the hard way. And they were just simply looking at one of their ancestors, Denise McMahon's Hiram Crawford, who, by the way, this is a photo of Hiram Crawford. Hiram Crawford was a coach driver on a 5-horse American-drawn wagon that would go from Albury to Melbourne or Albury to Sydney. Okay? And so they were employed by William Brickell and a gentleman named Adam Casner Kidd. They put me in touch with Carol Lundquist, who actually gave me in West Palm Beach a photo of the actual carriage that was owned, the one on the left, by Brickell and Kidd and driven by Hiram Crawford in the photograph itself. This is Hiram Crawford many years later in Oakham, Massachusetts. He was from Massachusetts. And one of the things that the girls were doing is they were looking into Americans and Canadians that would very much have been lost to time. They did not have to do that. Most history forgot the fact that many people from around the world went to the gold rush of California and later Australia, but would have been forgotten. And they started to dig and dig and dig. And so with that, I had a lot of good foundation, but still I had some questions. When I got to Australia, right behind the house I would stay in at my good friend Belinda Kershaw's home, I saw a very interesting sign that I was going to be watched over by the Brickells. This is in Australia. And Casey probably now is starting to nod his head, and others too, because in Brickell Park is the same plaything thing that they have that the related group put in after they used it as kind of a lot for their construction material. By the way, Casey Pickett's tour of Brickell, I learned a lot. I have a long way to learn about all the other stuff that I don't know about the Brickels. So at the back of Brickell Park, right, that circle is literally an identical copy. And again, I saw that as a little bit of a sign. William Brickell has a remarkable story to tell that starts out in Steubenville, Ohio. Interestingly enough, there's another interesting gentleman that I got to know very well, a guy named Frank Pasquarella of Frankie's Pizza, who was also from Steubenville, Ohio, the focus of my first book in Miami. William Brickell got his start at the young, ripe age of 27 on taking off on an 8-month journey from Steubenville across the United States to the gold rush in 1849. As you know, gold had a way of bringing people out from around the planet. And it wasn't just America, and it wasn't over just by land, and sometimes it was by sea. And folks, when I used to say by sea, remember that you have to understand that it wasn't odd to have an 85-day journey just to get from one port to another crossing the Pacific. Let me say that one more time. In an era that we get frustrated if we don't have a signal and we're impatient. There's a great comedian that likes to tell people that are fidgety with their phones and they're like frustrated, can you give it a second? It's going to space. Can you just give it a second? Can you imagine getting on a boat back then for 85 days? Waiting 85 just to get to where you need to get going. Or 8 months to get across, or I'm sorry, 5 months to get across the United States in a wagon train. Now, the wagon train we're talking about is 20 wagons that was organized by several 60 gentlemen from Steubenville, Ohio, originally known as the California Mining Company. And a month later, they realized, well, wait a second, after leaving Independence, Missouri, after taking a paddle wheel to St. Louis and on, this is going to be a little unwieldy. And they renegotiated their contract, and instead of 60 men and 20 cars, they took it at 10 men in a piece. They renegotiated all those contracts to say, we're going to go in teams of 10. Because they felt that they just weren't keeping up and they were dragging other people behind. And they knew that if they couldn't get through the certain pass at a certain time in the spring, or into, closing up into winter, they were going to have a real problem. They could have actually perished, which a lot of people did do. Once they got to California, it was dig as quick as you can. Now remember, in 1849, the bell is kind of rung. And the first people getting there, the scenes and the documentation of finding literal pound, 2, 3, 4, 7-pound nuggets. This happened. All it takes is one story about a 7-pound nugget, and you have the world at their door. And we have people from South America, from China, from all over the Pacific Rim going to California. You have a little bit of a problem. California had just come into the hands of the United States. They were nowhere near ready for the infrastructural meltdown, really, that happened. And there was a lot of problems that don't get really followed. There was a lot of crime, violence, there was murders, there was people after a while of not finding 7-pound nuggets that were starting to say, hey, look, you don't look like us. You shouldn't be here. There's a lot of that going on, okay? So they're, at first and foremost, they're finding 7 and 2-pound nuggets. Everything's hunky-dory, but when it gets down to small little things got tricky. And this was something that Australia was watching very closely, by the way. Australia was very hesitant to sound the big alarm that gold had been found in Australia until they really knew that there was enough to handle the thousands that would come. So even though word got out that Australia had hit big 4 years later, or 3 years later in 1852, they were very, very hesitant. But back in California, William Brickell and a gentleman named Kidd and others, we're going to talk about Kidd in a second, We're in the very middle of this kind of bowling alley of the gold towns in a place called Placerville. Everybody see Placerville in the middle of the slide. And they dug, and they made some money, but we can't really tell. I don't believe Brickell made a lot of money. We know this because when he left California, heading over, and this is some of the diggings that still are around in some state parks. I mean, they went crazy. People were just, and this is an era where they didn't have all their ducks in a row. Australia had, in comparison to California, all their ducks. They had all the permit processes, everything had to be very calculated, because if not, you'd have some problems selling your gold later. But in California, you had all these ships coming, bringing people, but nothing going out. The glut on the actual coastline of California is epic, and was a big problem. There wasn't enough places to put everybody. There was a hotel. There was tents all over. The city that we know of today was practically built by gold at an exacerbated quick rate. They say that both Sydney, well not Sydney, but more Melbourne and San Francisco have a very good connection to each other. They were both built, cities that should have taken 30 to 50 years to build, probably in a 10-acre period of time. They were built almost in record time because of all that gold. In the foreground, you see some of the different nationalities that were there in California and in Australia as well. When I went to Australia, there is still gold, not just in gold trinketry, but there are people that I met that says, yeah, I go on the weekend out to the fields, and every now and then I find a little speck of something. And they're still finding gold. It's so rich. Australia has so much natural resources that they have to actually farm out and get other companies and other investors from all around the world to mine everything that they still have today. It's bigger than they can actually handle. Now, I didn't find any gold, but I did find a gold watch. I guess I could have taken it, but I didn't. But one of the things that I struck gold in is going to the National Library in Melbourne and reading for the first time American Fever Australian Gold, which is Denise McMahon's and Christine Wilde's CD-ROM of all of the 307 some families that they didn't have to do much more than their family. They went overload. They did 307 American and Canadian families. But you can only read this CD in the state library. And now you can read it at FIU Special Collections. FIU is one of the few American universities here in the United States that have a copy of this report. In it, I also learned a few things that in Melbourne, the day before the Brickells left Melbourne, and I'm kind of reverse engineering this because this is where I first went to, Melbourne, but this is actually where they ended their journey in Australia. They stayed at this hotel, the Criterion Hotel, the day after they got married on May 20th of 1862. I was given a copy of by Denise McMahon over the internet of their marriage certificate. This is William Brickell marrying Mary Bulmer. The Bulmers were from England, a little place called Little Bolton, England. He was a bachelor, she was a spinster. This is the family of both of them. And they actually got married in not the Presbyterian Church, because the church on the right-hand side, today's known as Scots Church, wasn't built yet. They were married on the left building called the Manse. And on their wedding certificate, it says the word Manse in quotations. The Manse is no longer there, but I called the church up and said, yeah, we got one photo. There's only one photo of the man. Come on over, we'll show it to you right on the wall. Just like that. I had no idea that it would be that easy, but it was that easy. And thus, what you're seeing here, right outside the building, that's the new building where the old building once stood. Today it's called the Assembly Hall. And inside the Assembly Hall, I believe that this room, which is now a bookstore, is where William Brickell got married to Mary Bulmer. And this is the photo, the only known photo. The only other images of the man's are drawings. And even then, not very clear, kind of hazy, etc. But this is the only known photo now at FIU Archives, at Special Collections. Around the city of Melbourne, right before they left, I can tell you this, there are buildings that are still around today that were there the day they left. So the images you're seeing here, some of these buildings were there. And by the way, everything you saw when you were coming in, some of the photos that we were showing silently, are buildings that were there when Brickell and Mary were there, or when they came back to visit. They left on an 85-day trip to San Francisco on a boat called the Seaman's Bride. 85 days just to get from Melbourne to San Francisco. And after that, they took a separate trip from San Francisco to the Isthmus of Panama and crossed the isthmus by rail to a place called Aspinwall, to berthing at the very point of the dock that William and Adam Kidd probably walked in part, or took some sort of horse transportation to an area called Yackandandah, about 30 miles or west of today's Albury, where William would meet Mary. This is Yackandandah today, and it was a mess. People were just arriving there and just basically going to town on the landscape looking for gold. This is a bank building that today is actually the Historical Museum, where we did a little bit of work, but we couldn't really find any concrete evidence, even though it's in some of the journals that William Brickell's daughter Maud wrote many years ago that he did dig in Yackandandah, and we know that Kidd dug in Yackandandah. But there was no newspapers till about 1855 covering this, and so since it was 1853-ish, we don't have an actual bullet that says they were definitely there. But we do know that we learned in that museum that you had to have a miner's right, a miner's license, and you paid $1, similar to the $1 you paid for a wrecking license in the 1890s here in Florida. Ralph Monroe paid $1 state right to have a license. You had to have a license for your 12 by 12 spot of digging, and you better have it. You better have it clear, because if you found any gold there, they were going to check. So it was kind of a more organized approach to the mining. In Yackandandah, there's still places that show where the miners were, where they actually cut into the land to remove little intricacies of waterways so they can more efficiently pan for gold. But they basically very quickly went back to Albury and decided to get into the business of supporting the gold rush. This is not a photo of them, but just a representative sample of William Brickell and Adam Casner Kidd, focusing on Albury, which is alongside the mighty Murray River. Now, a little history lesson of Australia. The mighty Murray is pretty much like the mighty Mississippi. Almost for 1,300 miles, it was navigable through most of the year, but not all of the year. And one of the places it got to was this little place originally called the Crossing Point, later known as Albury. And at that crossing point, there was a shallow bank in one part of the river where you could, at certain times of the summer, cross with a horse. Maybe sometimes you'd get thrown off, and sometimes the horse would die, you'd die, and it was a little dangerous. You actually had to kind of crawl over to this one island and then get over to the other side. And eventually, they would fix that by building a bridge. We're going to get to that in a second. This is where Albury is at, pretty much 360 miles southwest of Sydney. And that was one great town that was situated perfectly to take advantage of all the gold rush. But still, a mighty, mighty river that initially, you had to cross by using, and in the middle of this shot is a very blurry drawing of what we call a punt, or a ferry. And originally, the only way to go across was using a ferry, which we're going to see in just a second. This tree signifies, and this tree is still there today, it's called the Hume tree. Hovell and Hume were the two kind of Lewis and Clarks that actually went out for the British government to explore and where to actually make this mother road to connect Melbourne and Sydney. And they chose Albury, or the crossing place, to do so. And today, when you go there, you can still see the indentation in the landscape right here. And we're going to get to the connection with Brickell in a second. But you see that indentation right there to the river. That's actually where the wagons would come down in the summer on the shallowest time to cross before there was a bridge. Later on, when there was a punt or a ferry. This is the Hume tree that still exists today. On the other side of the river, when you came across, there was a guy named Robert Brown who was selling produce. The original Robert is here, back in Australia. Sure enough, there's Robert Brown. He had a little Brown's hut, and he just sold produce. Amazing correlation there. But if you see the forded line there, you would ford, and then you would race to that little spit of an oval that was actually a little island in the middle of the river. If you can get to that island, you were clear. The rest of the crossing was pretty clear across the next little piece of river that would separate from the island to the other side. And years later, this particular monument, we know, actually existed inside the Brickell and Kidd store. They owned a store in Albury. And we know this because Brickell and Kidd were one of the first financiers of this particular monument that sits in the Botanical Preserve, and they actually gave about 21 pounds, and other people gave 21 pounds. By the way, 21 pounds, you were lucky if you were being paid as a normal day laborer, 5 pounds for a whole week of work. So 21 pounds doesn't sound like much. That's a lot of money back then. There was another occasion they gave 100 pounds each, with William Brickell and Adam Kidd, for a whopping total of 1,000 pounds if anybody could find a real big mine of gold within 10 miles limits of the Albury township. So they were doing quite well. And the funny thing about this monument is initially when it was inside the Brickell store, as it was, they were debating on where to put the monument, they noticed that as they were looking at this beautiful monument that had been ordered from America and shipped all the way over to Albury, initially it said, blah, 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 resurrected the inhabitants of the Hume River in honor of Hamilton Hume, one of the... And they noticed, wait a second, someone pointed out that the inhabitants of the Hume River means that the fish made this monument. And so they put in district there to... they crouched it in there because they wanted everybody not to necessarily laugh at them. What they didn't mean the fish inhabitants of the people. Just a little side note of humor. But that happened in the Brickell store. The debate over what to do with that monument took place. On the left side of this photograph is one of the old punts that are very symbolic of looking almost identical to the punt that William Brickell and Adam Kidd took over by the government, paying about 47 pounds per month, a contract that they had. Once they took that contract, then they had a particular toll roll that you had to pay when you brought horses and cargo across. And this is a little bit about the, $15 per month was the kind of the agreement with the government if you would take over that business. And they did, they made a lot of money. Apparently, in just about 5 or 6 years, they made about 10,000 pounds. So a lot of money back in those days. But still, it was a little bit tricky and a little bit dangerous, and eventually the community was talking to the Australian government, or the British government at the time, to build a bridge. And we're going to get into why in a second. During that time of them building their businesses, both the store, the service to bring people back, the carriage service, they also built a hotel on the property that you see there that says Adam Kidd, William W.B. Brickell there. They also own the property on Smollett and Townsend Street on the cross that says also A.C. Kidd and W.B. Brickell. This is from the plat maps. This is a bank building that Brickell and Kidd actually owned the land for. Again, this is some advertisements from coaches in those days. Here's an advertisement from Kidd and Brickell, that you would apply for, and you get into this and you head on out. You pay 4.5 pounds. Again, almost a whole week's worth of work just to be able to get on one of these carriages to go anywhere. That's 5 or 6 long days of work to able to afford. Eventually, by 1862, that would go up to about something like 10 pounds. So a considerable amount of money. They then built this particular building, the Brickell and Kidd Hotel, the Exchange Hotel. And they opened it with great fanfare, saying that they had the best of all the furniture and the rooms and the furnishings like no other place had ever seen. Now I found in the Sydney Library, the State Library in Sydney of Australia, William Brickell and Adam Kidd had to become citizens of Britain, British citizens, in order to own land. So William Brickell had to become a naturalized citizen before he could own land, making both Mary, who was British, and William, that is now British or owns dual residency. We have another linkage to our heritage, or British heritage. In a way, you can make a case in that. And the fine-tuned writing there, that's all in scribbly cursive, just said that he could be a citizen, but he couldn't be a part of the legislative or executive branches. So they'd give him citizenship, all these Americans, all these Canadians, but you can only go so far with it. So there was a little asterisk to that. Of course, they had the best wines and spirit, comfort unsurpassed in these hotels. Today, you can see on the bottom, it's not the hotel, but it's an old wool store that existed there in the late 1800s on Townsend and Smollett. It's also a major hotel chain called the Quest Hotel. I found that interesting because I was on my own quest, and here I was following the Brickels. This is a photo of the old wool place. And here's a rare drawing that shows on the corner. You see the building. I have a little bit of a pointer here if it works. The building that you see right, come on little guy. Well, the building right on that corner. There you go. That building right there is the Exchange Hotel. And this building, right to the right of this slide in the middle, with the kind of steep roof, that's an important building we're going to see later. That was the stables of the Exchange Hotel. And you went back there, it was par for the course that you were going to come in on horseback or with a carriage with horses. And part of checking into any hotel, there are people ready to valet, not your car, obviously, but your horse. And so that was a building that was owned by Brickell and Kidd. Here's a detail of that shop. I had fancy parties there, etc. This is a drawing. For many years, all we had was a drawing. And I actually got very excited when I went to Goulburn, Mary's hometown, when she was in her teens. And I found an Exchange Hotel. I got very excited. I booked it sight unseen. It was not the top accommodations, but I was very happy to be staying in an Exchange Hotel, much like the Brickels owned. Back at the library in Albury, they helped me find out, this is Greg Bryant, the president of the Historical Organization, and Joe Wooding. Going deeper, these men actually over the years had said to myself, and at one point in time I had 5 Australians in one room, all debating on where this photo that they swear they saw of the Exchange Hotel. And then another one said, well, wait a second, I think there was one more photo. No, there was only one photo. And they debated this for half an hour until they found a photo, this photo that only has the corner of the Exchange Hotel. So that little slice, that first little 2-3 inches on the left-hand side with the balcony is the Exchange Hotel. And then they brought out this amazing photo, the only known photo of the Brickell and Kidd Exchange Hotel in Australia. They made most of their money. And also, this is probably where William met Mary. And I'll tell you why in a second. Today, it's a hair salon and a hotel lobby, as I said, the Quest Hotel. They also had a store, the Brickell and Kidd store. It was on Townsend Street. We don't know exactly where it was, but they sold everything you could imagine. And this is only half the list. And I actually carried the list in my wallet. Yesterday I was at you can see on the manifest of the Arkwright is Joseph Bulmer, Catherine Bulmer, 29 years old, father 30, Eliza, and there is little Mary, age 3. Imagine. 80-some long. Yeah, you see the parents in the back saying, they started to, no way. Imagine, baby of 3, taking them on this voyage. Let me pause again, because here's the ship, the Pactulas, who brought William Brickell and Adam Kidd. Folks, at the time, it was a stark thing. Over 327 boats in an 18-month period at this time, in 1852 alone, were pretty much lost. Okay? They averaged 1 every 11 hour sunk. 2 every 75 hours was reefed somewhere, and the rest were just never heard from again. The Pactulas is a case point and sample. We believe we found the actual Pactulas. There's like 200 boats that were named Pactulas through the history of time of boats. But we believe we found that one, and that was no longer in operation, lost to sea just 2 years after it brought William Brickell and Kidd across. Again, they went out to Goulburn, the Bulmers, and the town of Goulburn is still as charming as it was the day. This is a building that actually existed not when Mary Brickell visited in 1891 and 1899 later, but when she was 3 years old. This is a building that was there this is another building that was there when she was in her teens. Beautiful architecture, super cold at night, even when I went 30 degrees. But this is a brochure of just the beautiful architecture in the heyday of Goulburn. Beautiful town. Gorgeous even today. I hiked to the top of this monument overlooking the beautiful valley. It's the site of a very large sheet, by the way, called the merino wool sheet you can climb up into. That's its claim to fame, but I'm here to tell you that another claim to fame is that this is Mary's childhood home. Very busy place, but unfortunately kind of passed over by the gold rush, because as people started pushing off over to Albury, it wasn't any longer the end of the line, it was actually the middle of the line. And when you would get to the good stuff, you had to get it to the end of the line. And that's when Joseph Bulmer moved his family to Albury. He died a couple of years later, but not until his son, Joseph Jr., actually started a timber operation, a timber place, selling timber for the growth of Albury. And when William Brickell met Mary, it's hard to tell exactly where, but we believe, consensus of all the historians is probably 1856 or 1857. We know that because in 1857, Mary goes back to Goulburn to have a child. Alice, who later in the history of Miami becomes the first postmistress when Brickell store was there, and actually handles a lot of the businesses during the heyday of the Brickell time. And they weren't married, which was kind of a big no-no back then. Probably could have besmirched both the Bulmer name and the Brickell name, and so she quietly went away from Albury, had the kid in Goulburn, and Mary did not put the father's name on the birth certificate. However, January 3rd, the baby's born. 1 month later, she had to not necessarily lie about who the father was on the baptism certificate. Now, the baptism certificate has never been found, but we found it miraculously in this warehouse in Goulburn. These two incredible volunteers worked feverishly when we finally found a document that was a transcription from the Presbyterian church files, and on page 49, and inside this building, which is the Presbyterian church that no longer exists today, in this very photograph, this is the photograph inside that building, on February the 4th, was the baptism of Annie Alice to William Brickell, which is a typo from transcribing, and Mary Bulmer. Okay, we were pretty sure because of the storekeeper there from Goulburn and Albury, etc. So we now have the only document that verifies that Alice was. And I say that because there was a lot of rumors about who Alice's father was and why they waited so many years to marry, etc. But that has been put to bed now. Now we have ink on paper. The church no longer exists. It was in this particular area, so it's no longer there. And they took me to the very place. In Albury, when they returned many years later, it's still today, when you come in on the train, is the exact location where the trains would have come in. It's a very long, rainproof kind of coverage there. And that's because in the old days, a train would come in from New South Wales, and if it wanted to go further to Melbourne, you had to jump the track to the other train because there were two different gauges. They weren't standardized gauges. And if it was in the middle of the night and raining, they didn't want the people to get wet. So this thing goes almost like a quarter mile, it seems, or an eighth of a mile. And you would transfer over to a different gauge line and your luggage and all that, and then go on. That still exists. So this particular architecture, this building, was definitely walked in. This 1860 courthouse would have been the very courthouse where Brickell and Kidd had to get their license to open up the hotel, etc., etc. So this salary and stalls were there, which is now a historical site. This building was there. Later on, even Brickell and Kidd were involved in the building of the bridge that would go across the Murray River. This is a photograph that was brought to me, and I almost kind of flipped out. Around 1860, the community told the government, we have to have a bridge. The government finally agrees. There were a lot of deaths crossing that bridge. It was inefficient. This was the main mother road from Sydney to Melbourne. And they finally relented, and they put it all out for bidding. And Brickell and Kidd won the bid at £7,500. Okay? So they got the contract to build the bridge. But they had to put an escrow account of £2,000, £1,000 each. And there had to be 2 business people on the contract. So Brickell and Kidd got the contract not only to build a bridge across a river, but to build the bridge across the main highway that connected at that time the 2 largest cities in Australia. So Brickell also has a hand in something epic. Now there's been 3 more bridges built over time, but the first bridge was built by William Brickell and Adam Kidd. And you can see the details of the contracts. They had to put £2,000. And this is a remarkable shot. 30 years later, by the way, this is right before they're about to tear down the original bridge. The first person to cross that bridge was Hiram Crawford, Denise McMahon's relative, working for Brickell, later on working for himself. These are some shots not from Albury, but just to get a feel for Albury at the heyday of this boom during that time. We've also chased down the identical place of where the original bridge was. Joe Wooding took me out right straight to it. And through this shot, which represents the second bridge there, you can see the old bridge about to be torn down. Today there's even a more modern bridge. So there's been 3 bridges. Inside the library, again, going into deeper files, and Joe and others helping me out, they said, well, wait a second, Caesar, we believe that the stables that were owned by William Brickell and Adam Kidd were still there, and they sure are. This is the Green Court Apartments today, with the original stables for the Exchange Hotel. The last known building that we can definitely say Brickell was inside, Kidd was inside, Mary could have even visited, etc. But these were the stables. Later on, the addition of the walkway, parapet was added later, but it was the location of the stables. It's a little bit of shoddy, you rent there for like $300 a month, and I laugh at that because obviously we know today when you're at Brickell Avenue, you're not going to find anything for $300 a month. So, it's a whole different Brickell of real estate. I was also able to meet with Mary, a descendant of Mary Bulmer. And this is actually Mary's brother's great-great-grandson. I met him in Sydney. He's the only person of the Bulmers that really is interested at all in the history of their family. So they're starting to dig up more stuff on Mary. Hopefully we'll find out some more things. He led me, and some maps led me, but he in particular led me to a little bit of a mystery of the Bulmers, and they are actually buried in Albury in the Pioneer Cemetery at this particular grave site. And there's a bunch of names written on there, but Joseph Bulmer's name, the father, is not on there. That's because he was actually buried at a different cemetery that later was used to unfortunately grab road building material. And if you know anything about the history of Miami, you know that when Royal Palm came in and we needed material to start, paving the roads and this clearing area, we unfortunately decimated the Tequesta Indian burial mound. Same thing goes here. Those remains were told within 1 month had to be moved out. The Bulmers were very much in the city, so they believe that his remains, even though it's not on the gravesite itself, were moved into the family plot. This is some images of Sydney, just to show you historical ones, and also places that are still around, that were around when they revisited Sydney years later. And speaking of that, when they came back to Australia, and again, back through the many buildings that are still around today, William Brickell gave an interesting interview to a local paper, I believe it was called Border Post. And in that, he talks about that Mr. Brickell was now a large landholder in Florida, married in the early days, a sister of Joseph Bulmer, with his wife, is on a brief visit to the scene of his early married life. And let me pause there. The scene of his early married life was one day. Remember, they left the day after they married, so it's very hard to really trace the scene of your entire married life in Australia. What they really meant is the life they had before they got married. Okay, but of course, you have to take a grain of salt with the Brickels, by the way, and William in particular, he was an incredible storyteller, and sometimes he stole the doozy. He, of course, sees great changes in Albury in his recollection, but not so great. He's kind of now criticizing Australia and their wool industry by kind of selling it off to other people and other entities and not keeping it for themselves. He also talks here at the end. Mr. Brickell, among other possessions, owns an entire town of 20,000 inhabitants. It's a little bit of a stretch that he owns the town, but you never know. Could have been Brickell waxing poetic, and the writer went a little crazy. But could have been Brickell too, going a little far. Which has sprung into his... Do you know what today 2,000 acres would cost in Miami? Crazy. But the complexity of just buying those parcels of land from Harriet English, who inherited from her son who died, was so complex that he had to spend 2 years legally untangling all the deeds of that land to finally get that land. But why would William Brickell, in 1870, buy 2,507.83 acres of land? And that's a talk for another time. But I do want to tell you this. One big thing I got out of Australia is that the Brickells knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew how to put just the right bait out for just the right fish. I'll leave it at that. With that said, thank you very much. I'll take any questions you have. And we'll any questions that I may help you with? Yes?
Just a couple of date
Yes.
clarifications.
Yes.
When did he and Mary leave Australia? Did they come,
May 21st, 1862.
okay, and did they take a similar route back to the United States?
They took the route to San Francisco first, across the Pacific, down to another ship, down to the Isthmus of Panama, where they were delayed a while because we believe, and pretty much know now, they had their second born while they were in Panama.
And did they come directly to
And
Miami?
they came then to New York, then to DC, then to Cleveland, Ohio, and then to Miami.
And so when did they arrive in Miami?
1871.
Okay, so and what was the year they went back to Australia?
Now this is a new stuff that's just come in. I do know that in 1891, and I believe in 1899, don't hold me to that because there could be a third trip now, and now my dates are all, but they did go back definitely one time, maybe two, and they may have gone back 3 times. Mary's mother was still there, and it was still family they wanted to visit. However, later they would bring Mary's mother, Catherine, over to the United States. But that's a little too, Beth is on it, Beth Brickell, but it's a little fuzzy. Even the interview and when it happened and how long they stayed, I don't want to go too far, but it was definitely, Brickell dies in 1908, so it was definitely before, and it was definitely, I don't think they went there past 1900. I think it was 1891 and 1899.
Caesar, what was the date of that article?
What's that?
What was the date of the article?
The article was dated, I believe, in the 1891 trip. But again, I've got a lot of, this is the first time I've done this talk all in one shot, so I have to go back and fine tune, but that one was probably 1891.
But wasn't there a reference to the city of Miami?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 1899. I'm sorry, that was turn of the century because the bridge was demolished, sorry. The bridge was demolished right about the time, right before the turn of the century, and they went back and they saw the whole bridge, so. I'm gonna have this, with these new 2 trips thrown in there, I've got to look at all that. But they definitely went back in 1899. I think that's when that article took place. My apologies, you're right. I've got it. It's a little, it can get a little bit unwieldy.
How old were they when they got married?
William got to Australia by age 28. Mary's 10 years later, like 38, and Mary was like 20. I'm a little rusty on that, but she was in her early 20s, and he was about 30 something. I'm going to get to that later. I'll have that locked down, but not definitely wasn't.
I wonder if there might be any information or evidence that they had left some gold in Australia. I'm interested about this business about sailing back to Australia several times. I mean, yeah, her mother was there, but
That's a really good question. One thing that I haven't really looked into is how people move their money and their.
like with customs, they might have, I don't know.
That's a really. Casey and I were talking about that there needs to be a study done on how people really. And there were banks, and I'm sure, but it's a lot of money we're talking about. Apparently, on one particular diary of one of the people that were on the ship said that there was over $1 million worth of cargo on the ship that the Brickells were on when they were going back, on all the ships that they took to go back. So, I don't know what they mean by $1 million. I don't know if there was cash, I don't know if there was gold.
Of course, that was a custom that Mary Brickell kept with his father cash here in Miami.
Yeah, there's a custom, and there's
Never
a
trusted banks, so.
never trusted banks. There's stories that the Brickels hid things in the walls of their house. There's corroborations by Bob Carr and others that witnessed the inside of the old mansion with wall punch marks of people went in there looking for all the hidden cash, etc. Any other questions? I have one special presentation of a plaque here in a second. Anybody else? Don, would you come back up here for one more second? Can we have the lights on if we can? Let's see. So Don has done me the honor not only of being my friend, but also in helping me in this next endeavor. Because these two women have done, and Don, I think you'll agree that just the information just on the Brickels, and you'd be surprised at what Vicki Silvera and FIE now has in her hands, the 307 families that would have been lost to time. Don's going to help me send this award to Denise McMahon and Christine Wilde over to Australia with as many goodies as you can from your council. Thank you, Don. But they're really the unsung heroes of the research. And on a few occasions, we pushed it further and learned more. And even they were excited on a couple of occasions as we were finding new things. They were kind of thankful.
I have something for you.
Oh, okay.
During the last couple of years, Australia has been celebrating 100 years of mateship with the United States, which started on the fields of France during World War I. And ever since the 1917, 18, 19 time period, Australia has been in the field with American troops everywhere in the world, including today, from Afghanistan to the Horn of Africa and around the world. So this has been a 100-year anniversary. Now, Caesar has taken it back further. So we now know, of course, through his study of the Brickels, that our relationship with Australia goes back even further than that. But this is from Ambassador Joe Hockey, who is so impressed with what you've done, and he has sent you this book on mateship for you to have as part of it.
Hold it up.
Wow, signed.
Hold it up for a photo.
Yeah, look at that.
There you go.
Yeah, let's,
Show the cover.
what an honor. Thank you so much. Wow. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you, my friend.
We have a certificate for you.
Oh, wow.
Just a little something of our appreciation. And this, I'd have to say, is worth less than $100,000. But thank you, Caesar, so much for presenting the Brickels here first, and for our audience. Thank you, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Caesar.
I appreciate it. Wow.
Look at me.
I'm honored. Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you all for coming out. I appreciate it.